The remote Pacific site were a strange collection of structures caught American forces unaware.
The Japanese military fortified everything they could, cave systems, tunnel systems, so that when the Allied forces finally landed, they would be entering into a meat grinder.
The derelict Irish prison, where the inmates struggled to break in as well as out.
A lot of very high-risk inmates arrive, and this place simply isn't designed to hold them.
A massive complex in France with an explosive past.
No one knows what happened for sure. Everything disappeared in one huge bang. Was it deliberate? Was it accidental? Was it sabotage?
And the Spanish ghost town, where US freedom fighters fought to the death for a better world.
We see a lot of graffiti, which itself has some real significance in solving this mystery.
Decaying relics, ruins of lost worlds, forged through years of toil, now haunted by the past. Their secrets waiting to be revealed. In the Western Pacific, foreboding ruins scattered across the Japanese island of Iijima make for a confounding sight.
This island is so unusual looking. It's almost entirely flat, but then you have this bulging mountain standing right in the middle of it.
Looking down on it, it looks almost like an aircraft carrier.
And someone has built 3 runways here.
You'll see some old airfields with weeds growing up, through cracks in the pavement.
It's not immediately clear who was flying in or out of this place. The modern-day town hides the first clue.
There's a building that looks completely out of place in a 21st century context. It looks battle-scarred, it's got gaping holes in it.
Structures hidden below ground are no less intriguing.
And it has a lot of naturally occurring caves, some of which could be engineered into excellent defensive positions.
They're pretty well sheltered. From the outside, you have no idea of what a large complex exists behind those entrances.
What links the disused runway to the blown-out building and the fortified caves that lie below this island? A torn-out concrete shell hiding in the modern-day town of E is the only building on the island that survived the Second World War. Local guide Tamae Takamichi knows exactly what this place once was.
This building is the remains of the municipal pawn shop. It was built before the war and made out of concrete.
The one old concrete building left on this island from the old days is the pawn shop. The pawn shop is pretty much the local bank, and that means that it's got to be a strong, safe place. It has been torn to pieces. It has clearly been in a fight.
The big holes are damage from artillery, and the small ones, these are from rifle fire.
1,000 miles from Tokyo, Iijima is part of the Japanese archipelago.
Since we're here in the Pacific Ocean, a very contested space near the home islands of Japan, this place obviously had military significance.
Iijima has got some nice long runways that go straight out over the Pacific Ocean. That means it's easy to take off, it's easy to land, it's a big, safe airport.
During the Second World War, these overgrown airfields were among the largest in Asia. The Japanese had built them to aid their expansion in the Pacific. But by 1944, they'd been forced to change their tactics.
The Japanese had learned they didn't have the resources to stop the Americans anymore. So instead of going out to meet in battle out over the ocean, they dug in. They went to ground.
Meanwhile, from across the Pacific, the Americans envied Iijima's airfields.
If you don't have Iijima, then you don't have that clear path that takes you from the American mainland to Hawaii and step by step across the Pacific to take Japan.
Iijima is the ideal place to land heavy military equipment.
The island itself has got some nice, neatly shelving beaches around its perimeter.
Then around the island, you can see a whole bunch of entrances to little caves.
These coastal caves lie below the flat stone plateau that covers this place, punctuated only once by Mount Gasuku, the spectacular peak at its heart.
The island itself is pretty natural as a defensive position because the pinnacle in the middle of the island enable an all-around defense.
On home turf, the Japanese knew just how to defend this peculiar place.
What the Japanese wanted to do, ideally, was to make it difficult for the Americans to land by using artillery and defend the island in depth using infantry who were comparatively poorly prepared.
The Japanese smashed the airfields, built pillbox positions, and laid mines. But most importantly, they made full use of Mount Gasuku. Below ground, this limestone peak is riddled with tunnels and caves, which the Japanese planned to use to move around undetected. They secured the tunnel entrances, built machine gun positions, and fortified caves, some 3 stories high, with lookouts across the island.
They fortified everything they could from cave systems, tunnel systems, so that when the Allied forces finally landed, they would be entering into a meat grinder.
Iijima's civilian population took refuge in the caves round the coast. Local residents like Tamae Takamichi still revere this place.
It's a sacred place on Iijima, and during the war, many people sought refuge here. This place received many mortar shell attacks from the sea, so people came here because it was safe.
With no idea what was going on underground, when the American forces finally arrived, they weren't prepared for an unseen and deadly foe. The 16th of April, 1945, the US Army invades Iijima.
The Americans had spent the whole Second World War learning how to conduct amphibious operations.
But the thousands of Japanese soldiers installed in Mount Gasuku could see their every move. The American advance to the town of E was under constant ambush. And they couldn't tell civilians and Japanese soldiers apart.
During the battle for Iijima, civilians also took up arms. Some civilians were told by the Japanese army to fight with guns, but they mainly used grenades.
Slow progress and the unexpected loss of hundreds of men meant the Americans had to take the high ground of Mount Gasuku, which lay beyond the town of E. The grueling conflict was witnessed by the famous US war reporter Ernie Pyle.
Ernie Pyle was an American newspaper columnist who was beloved for his devotion to the troops.
He was one of these war correspondence with a human touch. He really knew the GIs.
Pyle was traveling with the troops near the town of E when they came under fire. A sniper hit him in the head. Pyle was killed instantly.
True to his nature, he was pressing right up close to be near the action when he was killed on Ieshima.
With Pyle gone, the Americans were determined to get the job done. Beyond Pyle's memorial, today there's one other remnant of the bitter battle that played out: the shell of the concrete pawn shop.
This building did not necessarily serve any strategic purpose for the United States, but it was caught in the crossfire.
They pulverized this pawn shop on the way to pulverizing the Japanese headquarters.
The Americans eventually took Mount Gasuku, but traces still lie below this place that suggest, for the people of E, the full horror of the war was not yet over.
The Japanese military had convinced the population that the American forces would be like wild animals and no one would survive their onslaught. On E Island, they actually issued people hand grenades.
If all else fails, they were to kill themselves rather than suffer the disgrace of surrender.
In Ijima's coastal caves, hundreds of civilians took their own lives. Those in the Niatia cave didn't believe the propaganda and chose not to.
Many died inside these caves. However, at this particular cave, that tragedy didn't happen.
After a grueling 6-day battle, the Americans took Ijima. In total, almost 5,000 Japanese and more than 1,000 American soldiers lost their lives in the fight for Ijima. And some claim that Japan's resolute defense of this tiny island led the US to drop the atomic bombs that finally ended the war in this region. But Ijima still had one more role to play.
At the end of the war, the Japanese went to the Philippines via here.
After taking off from Ijima, the delegation agreed peace terms in Manila before submitting to a public display.
We've all heard about the Japanese surrendering to General MacArthur on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. But in fact, the initial surrender happened here at one of these airstrips. This is an almost forgotten part of the history of the war.
Today, little remains of the bloody battle for Ijima. But the memory of the thousands of soldiers and civilians who died here lives on.
This place is one of the few places left from the war, not only for Ijima, but also for Okinawa, so we are preserving it carefully.
Marooned in the chilly waters of the Celtic Sea, a cluster of structures guards Ireland's biggest harbour.
This island unambiguously has pride of place.
It's exposed, it's windy, it's isolated.
There are ditches, fences, and walls. This says security and strength.
It's really quite clear that this place was a fort. So there's also a sense that there was something else happening here.
This part is dark, it's quiet, there are bars on the windows. There's a sort of oppressive feeling.
And the darkness just swallows you up the further you go inside.
It feels like something of a time machine. There are parts that are quite obviously several centuries old and other bits that only seem like 20 years old.
At the center of the complex is a long building that appears to offer up some clues.
There's clearly evidence of fire having swept through this place at some point.
It feels like something actually quite violent happened here.
It's those burnt-out ruins that really draw you in and make you wonder what happened here.
This is Spike Island. Today, it sits in Irish waters. Yet these defensive structures were built by the British more than 200 years ago. Local historian Tom O'Neill once worked here.
The fort here was built by the British because they were always afraid that an enemy of theirs would invade Ireland and use Ireland then as a base through which to attack the mainland UK.
Building this strategically vital fort cost almost £100 million in today's money.
This was a really significant project. They started in 1806 and it took 60 years to build across a 24-acre site, and it's cutting-edge military technology.
From here, we can actually get a perfect idea of how clever the design was to make this fort as strong as possible.
Deep trenches surround the fort, which is built in a distinctive star shape to protect it from every direction. The design worked. No enemy ever attacked the fort.
But that doesn't mean it's going to escape violence altogether. Much later in its life, it's going to be attacked from within.
The defensive role wasn't the only thing this place was used for. There's more than one story to tell about this place.
Bars on windows, security spikes, and reinforced gates show how the British retooled their prized bastion to control the Irish instead.
Being on an island with fortified high walls and excellent observation and lookout positions, that also made this site ideal to be a prison.
In 1845, the Great Famine hit Ireland, and this imperious star-shaped fort became a pauper's prison.
People became more desperate, and some were even willing to be arrested and imprisoned just to get some food.
The situation was so dire that these fortified walls soon held thousands of prisoners. Additionally, with the British government using Spike Island as a stopover for convicts en route to criminal colonies, the population swelled.
And the numbers kept on rising because of the numbers that were being arrested and imprisoned, until eventually we had 2,500 here. And that 2,500 made it one of the largest prisons in the world at the time.
Eventually, the famine passed, and the prison closed in 1883. But this would not last for long. In 1916, when the Irish Republicans rebelled against Britain's oppressive military rule, the fort again proved invaluable.
During the Irish War of Independence, this site was brought back into use again as a prison. And some of the rooms have changed very little since then.
This was where the convicted Republicans were held. This would have been their living quarters, their sleeping quarters, their dining quarters, their recreation quarters.
With British soldiers guarding Republican internees, hostility between them was inevitable.
And there was some pretty serious tension between these prisoners who had fought on one side and the guards who were their enemies.
Obviously, there was friction. These were the individuals that had been attempting to kill Crown forces anyway.
The famous revolutionaries who came through this place ran rings round the British.
There was one particularly important individual here with the prisoners, and his real name was Tom Malone. He made a name for himself attacking and destroying RIC barracks. He was fairly near the top of the Crown Forces most wanted list, and he was arrested in Cork City on Christmas morning 1920.
Malone was a commander in the Republican Army. He was once described as Ireland's Houdini when he escaped this fortress jail, helped by the prison's Catholic chaplain. His comrades had to remain inside until Irish independence in 1921. But modern cell doors, locks and partitions suggest Spike Island's role as a prison wasn't yet over.
In 1985, the fort was again used as a prison, but a civilian prison this time. There had been a spate of increased crime, and so Spike Island was opened up again to absorb some of these extra inmates.
This time, it was the Irish themselves who put the prison fort to use.
This area was converted into modern cells in 1985. There were 25 four-man cells in total, and that then gave the civil prison a capacity of 102.
Other blocks were less well secured.
The plan was to send fairly low-risk inmates to Spike Island. And if that had been followed through, there wouldn't have been a problem.
But when prison governors got the opportunity to get rid of some prisoners, well, naturally enough, they got rid of their troublemakers if they possibly could.
A lot of very high-risk inmates arrive, and this place simply isn't designed to hold them.
Damage found at one part of the makeshift jail points to the consequences.
As you look closer and you see the damage, you see the fire damage, the charred windows, you realize that there was some final dramatic event that was the last chapter of this site.
Spike Island, a fort turned prison in the Republic of Ireland. Tasked with housing a number of high-risk offenders in an ill-equipped cell block, violence soon erupted. Tom O'Neill was a guard here at the time. He witnessed the chaos that ensued.
This was one of the dormitories where prisoners were held in 1985. On the night of the 31st of August, just before midnight, the riot started. The prisoners simply broke up the wooden floor and set fire to it. And when the fire was on, they simply kicked down the wooden doors and escaped.
They even managed to get as far as the pier, but they couldn't get any further, and that's why you build a prison on an island.
They can't get off, so they decide to do the next best thing. They decide to break back into the prison and destroy all the records there.
But the fully bastioned British-built fort wasn't that easy to break into. The prisoners had to use an excavator to break down the doors.
The riot was just a simple wanton destruction. Photocopiers turned upside down and smacked off the ground. Tins of paint opened and scattered all over the place. It's just the wanton destruction of it, really.
The riot was eventually contained. Spike Island was used as a prison for another 20 years.
The prison was remodeled and made much more secure. They'd learned their lesson.
Eventually, it closed fully in 2004, primarily because of the cost of keeping prisoners here.
Having spent nearly 200 years off limits to civilians, Spike Island is now open to the public. Its colorful history preserved for generations to come.
But what we really have here is a place that provides snapshots of Ireland's history at crucial moments and the conflict that could characterize that history and the violence that was there as well.
In Spain, the remains of a hilltop ghost town reveal that this site is steeped in religion.
This place has been inhabited for centuries, at least since the Knights Templar in the Middle Ages.
These little towns in the Spanish hills were always on the very edge of survival.
The most prominent building is the church.
It was clearly the center of this community.
But as you get a little closer, you can see it's in ruins.
This is a place that has been torn to pieces. And here we've got buildings that look like they've been scorched and crumbled.
A lot of these structures have been leveled by artillery. We see the stonework pockmarked with shell fragments, bullet holes, that sort of thing.
But there are traces of who was at war here.
We see a lot of graffiti, which itself has some real significance in solving this mystery. And then if we poke around a little more, we come across this plaque to Robert Hale Merriman.
That does not sound Spanish. And when I read further and I see the name Abraham Lincoln, I know that Americans have done something significant here.
A band of freedom fighters once came to this desolate site and left their idealism smashed in these ruins. This is Corbera Debray. Today, there's little left of the thriving community where Joan Montaña's father was born in the 1920s.
We are in one of the main streets of the old town. You have to imagine, it was all houses here. You can even see the remains of the original cobbled street. And these are the foundations of the house where my father was born.
Back then, the residents of Corbera lived as they had done for centuries. The church and the landowners held all the power.
The main church was built here back in the 13th century. And the nerve center of this rural community was the church square.
Once upon a time, this little Spanish village might have been filled with poor people, but they were poor people who were strong in their Christian faith, and they understood themselves as subjects of a Catholic monarchy.
Yet the damage wrought on this church suggests something changed. In 1931, a new left-wing government sought to wrest control from the Catholic landowners who ruled Spain. But it faced strong opposition.
There was an extreme right-wing military clique who felt that they had a chance to save Spain. You have senior army officers, you've got some very wealthy people, and you've got a Catholic Church. And that is the Nationalist Party.
In 1936, led by the fascist general Francisco Franco, the nationalists staged a coup and a bitter civil war broke out. The rubble of Corbera reveals how the conflict soon reached the town.
Here we can make out the traces of a series of historical marks. This graffiti from the time reads, "Seized Siente."
The CNT, it's the Spanish acronym for the National Labor Confederation. What that meant in that place and that time was that these guys were anarchists.
The anarchists had taken advantage of the conflict. One armed faction swept into Corbera.
When the CNT anarchists occupied this village, they saw the village priest as part of the nationalists, the fascists, the enemy. And so they did them in.
The anarchists killed Corbera's priest and his assistants. But when they left, the town itself was still standing. Meanwhile, the rest of Spain was swept up in the uneven fight between the fascist nationalists and the left-wing Republicans.
The Republicans, the government side in the Spanish Civil War, have to fight throughout with one hand tied behind their back. They have no American aid, no British aid, against this big organized nationalist army completely funded and supplied by fascist Italy and Nazi Germany.
In the 1930s, there were plenty of young idealists who were willing to fight for democracy.
2,800 Americans volunteered to fight on the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War, and they came to be known as the Lincoln Brigade.
Some of the most important writers and thinkers of the day wanted to go sign up to fight. Ernest Hemingway covered the war as a newspaper correspondent, and George Orwell spent time fighting with the Republicans.
The cause attracted lesser-known freedom fighters too.
Robert Hale Merriman, the commander of the Lincoln Brigade, and he gives up his studies to go over and lead this brigade in the Spanish Civil War.
By the start of 1938, Corbera had so far escaped the carnage of Spain's vicious civil war. But pockmarked houses and swathes of derelict ground suggest that this would soon change. Corbera's proximity to the Ebro River meant the conflict was fast approaching.
If the nationalists can take the Ebro River and push to the sea, they're then going to drive a wedge between the Republican stronghold. So it's vital for the nationalists to win there, and it's vital for the Republicans to hold there.
On the outskirts of Corbera, Merriman and the exhausted Lincoln Brigade dug in with the Republicans.
By March 1938, we know soldiers were camped here, very close to Corbera. These soldiers were members of the International Brigade, and they were suffering a lot. They were being defeated, and they'd come to the vicinity of Corbera to regroup.
Merriman believed if he could just reach the Republican-held town, he and his men would be safe. But unbeknown to him, the fascist nationalists had seized Corbera. Merriman was now trapped behind enemy lines. And in April 1938, just outside Corbera, he unwittingly walked into a nationalist camp.
And Merriman and his second-in-command are captured by their enemies. And so far as we can tell, they were probably put up against a wall and shot right there on the spot.
The Republicans fought on. Eventually, they recaptured Corbera. But this bare hill, once covered in houses, took the brunt of the fascists' revenge.
The very day the Republicans reconquered Corbera, the bombing started and continued almost daily.
Mussolini sent troops to aid the nationalists led by General Franco. The Germans send the Condor Legion, this advanced air force. Franco says, I'm going to destroy the Republicans in a battle of attrition, and that battle is focused on this village of Corbera.
In August 1938, Corbera was occupied by Republican forces, putting it firmly in the crosshairs of General Franco's fascist army.
This place was protected from artillery fire, so some soldiers made makeshift shelters here. They dug in and took advantage of the house wall. And after the bombing stopped, the strafing started. We can still see the impact on this wall.
When the Battle of the River Ebro finally ended, most of Corbera had been destroyed.
They call Corbera the eternal flame. Nails and other metallic things are melted and fossilized here. We can even see the key that was used to open a tin of sardines.
Just a glance at the village of Corbera and the destruction there, it points again to the savagery of the Spanish Civil War.
General Franco's Nationalist Party took control of Spain in 1939 and ran the country as a dictatorship for almost 40 years.
When Spain was again peaceful, but a dictatorship, the villagers came back and the place had been pounded to smithereens. They rebuilt their village down by the road.
Today, Corbera remembers those who fought to the death for a better world.
They came to stop the kind of fascism that was going to be the ruin of Europe in the years to come. These are people who were killing Nazis at a time when governments weren't ready for that yet. The first people to do that are these idealistic volunteers in Spain.
Near the border between Germany and France, in the long disputed region of Alsace, lies a mysterious complex with an explosive past.
There's a big central building where all of the glass has been shattered, blown out. Something violent happened here.
When you look up, you've got these crazy structures just perched high up there above, looking down on everything.
Whatever was being made, someone went to great efforts to transport it out of here.
It has a train line running through that's completely overgrown. It's clearly not been used in decades. And there, on the tracks, is a train that's just been left.
This incongruous collection of derelict buildings seems to make little sense.
There's something here that people are willing to kill over. It's that precious and that essential.
The first clue to what's going on here lies half a mile underground.
They were digging for some valuable commodity here, but it wasn't gold, it wasn't diamonds, it wasn't silver.
This sprawling plant is Caro Rudolph. It was built to extract a precious mineral from deep underground. Jean Misiano once worked here.
I spent 30 years working for this enterprise, where working conditions were incredibly tough. This is the elevator that carried the miners both up and down. We're at the top of the Rudolph 1 shaft, which went down 750 meters.
It was nasty work down in the mines. It was hot and cramped, and if you hit a pocket of gas, it could trigger a deadly explosion.
It's very dangerous here, and expensive trying to get this mineral out.
More than 600 people lost their lives here during a century of operation. What precious mineral was worth this level of risk?
Caro Rudolph, at the beginning of the 20th century, was a strategic place for the production of a mineral called potash.
Potash is one of the best fertilizers going, and Caro Rudolph was sitting on top of the mother lode.
The first mine opened here in 1913 to extract the mineral the whole world wanted.
At the beginning of the 20th century, we have a big explosion in population. We need to very quickly grow more crops and better crops, and for that you need fertilizer. And a major part of fertilizer is potassium. And here, potash, buried underground, contains that magic ingredient.
This site lies in Alsace, a region that France and Germany had long fought over. The opening of this place made it even more desirable.
Caro Rudolph was one of the only potash mines in the world outside of Germany, but that put a huge target on its back.
When World War I breaks out in August 1914, in that initial German rush into France, they overrun the Caro Rudolph and they take this mother lode of potash.
Even more worrying is that potash is a key ingredient in gunpowder.
This overgrown railroad once headed towards the battle trenches of World War I, and it wasn't only carrying the ingredients for gunpowder.
Intelligence reports suggested that ammunition was seen leaving this industrial complex.
From 1914 to 1915, the Germans installed a narrow-gauge railway, starting here at Caro Rudolph. The munitions were transported to the front by train.
Now that it was key to the German war effort, both the British and many French locals wanted to destroy this place. So who got there first?
New Year's Eve, the last day of 1915, this whole potash facility is just ripped apart by a tremendous explosion.
The entire complex was reduced to rubble. The munitions secretly stored at the factory only added to the blast.
It shook houses and rattled windows 20 miles away from the site. But the mystery persists. Who did it?
It would make sense if it was an Allied aerial bombing attack on the mine. But if you asked the locals, they didn't believe it.
Attacking on the 31st of December is symbolic, since it's New Year's Eve and everybody celebrates then, so they might have celebrated this victory too.
It's an interesting date to have an industrial accident. You'd normally expect that to happen when everything was in full flow. We'll never know.
Whatever caused it, the blast meant the mine was out of action until long after the First World War ended. By which time, Cairo Rudolph was back under French control.
It didn't actually open again till 1929, but then it was into full flow because the world still needed potash.
The crazed collection of structures that litter the site were all built to supply this pressing need.
The thing that fascinates me most about this site is, of course, the headstocks, these huge sheds that you see up in the sky.
The mine relied on lifting hundreds of tons of rubble out of the ground. It was brought to the surface on a cable system which ran through enormous pulley wheels attached to the structures.
Over the coming decades, 500 million tons of potash were mined here. But as they dug even deeper, the cost of extraction grew. Eventually, in 2003, the last mine shaft closed. Today, the dormant mine stands empty.
It may have seen out 2 world wars, but the hulk of the machinery and what's left behind tells the story of the actual people that worked here.
Abandoned, disintegrating, reclaimed by nature. Structures once at the cutting edge, bearing witness to the forces, pioneers and villains that define the world today. Emblems of a shared past, standing in our present.